As I mentioned, our text this morning will be Esther chapter 8. Esther chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, the plot he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each person in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On the day throughout all the provinces of, on one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city where the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. This is the word of the Lord. May it stand firm and sure forevermore. Beloved congregation of our Lord Jesus Christ, in most stories that pit heroes against villains, the villain's death is what draws the tale to a close. And that's because, generally speaking, the villain's demise resolves the central crisis of the tale. And in such stories, it's often the case that the way in which the villain meets their doom provides a sense of justice as well as resolution. And that's because more often than not, villains tend to get hoisted by their own petard. Now, I realize that that is not a terribly common saying. So what does it mean? Well, to be hoisted by one's own petard is a proverbial saying that was coined by William Shakespeare in his play Hamlet. And to appreciate what Shakespeare is on about here, you need to know that a petard is a French word which refers to a small explosive device. And as such, if someone gets hoisted by their own petard, it means that they've effectively been blown up by their own bomb. And that's the way that most storybook villains tend to get done in. The schemes that they've devised to bring harm to others end up creating circumstances which inevitably lead to their undoing. And there's a certain sense of poetic justice in watching a villain being brought down by means of their own devising. And that's the way that things are supposed to go. That villain falls victim to their own plot, calamity is avoided, and then the heroes ride off into the sunset to live happily ever after. These are the endings that we're familiar with. These are the endings that we've come to expect, and these are the conclusions that leave us with a contented sense of satisfaction. But that isn't what happens here in chapter 8 of Esther. Sure, Haman's execution sees justice done and the villain slain. And the manner of his execution, it constitutes the literal definition of being hoisted by one's own petard. After all, Xerxes had ordered that Haman be hung on the very gallows on which he had intended to hang Mordecai. And I want to say just a brief word here about that gallows. It's likely that this wasn't the kind of gallows that we tend to be familiar with today. Rather, it's likely that this gallows was a stake on which victims were impaled rather than hung. And this was no ordinary stake. The stake that Haman had ordered to be constructed, it was 75 feet tall. So when we say that Haman was hoisted by his own petard, man, was he hoisted. And we're reminded again that with Haman, it's always been about extremes. It wasn't enough for Haman to see Mordecai dead. He wanted to see him publicly scorned and humiliated, and he wanted everyone in Susa to know that he had been the one who had engineered Mordecai's downfall. But ultimately, it's Haman. Haman, the wicked Agagite and the enemy of the Jews, who ends up being shamefully executed on that stake. And it's a shame that's intensified by the fact that everyone knew that Haman was the one who had ordered that stake to be constructed. Talk about being the architect of your own destruction. And it's not just that Haman has been done away with, the heroes have also been rewarded, and handsomely so. In keeping with Persian custom, the property of those who were convicted of capital crimes is seized by, it's confiscated by the crown. And again, in keeping with Persian customs, Xerxes turns around and he transfers ownership of this property over to Esther. Remember, the position that Xerxes in, he is obligated as king to reward loyalty. He's obligated to reward those who have sought his good and his welfare. And that's exactly what Esther has done by exposing Haman's treasonous plot. And given that in Persian society and culture, women could own property independently, this immediately makes Esther one of the wealthiest people in the entire empire. Now, Esther then, in turn, she takes that property that she's received from the hand of the king, and she names Mordecai as its steward, as its manager. She appoints Mordecai to manage those estates on her behalf. And I just want to pause here for a moment. I want to pause here and to say something about the significance of Esther's behavior here. Remember how at the outset of the story, Mordecai had been the one who had cared for Esther. He'd been the one to take her into his home and to treat her as his own daughter after she had been orphaned. And even when Esther is separated from him, even when she's been withdrawn behind the walls of the harem, Mordecai had continued to care for her from a distance. But now, here in chapter 8, it's Esther who becomes Mordecai's benefactor. And where he had once sought after her welfare, now she becomes the agent of his advancement. And brothers and sisters, I'd like to suggest to you that this is noteworthy for two reasons. First of all, we need to understand that this chapter 8, and really the whole of the end of chapter 7 right through chapter 10, these are chapters that are filled with instances of dramatic reversal. In these final passages, we watch as the proud are cast down while the humble are exalted. We watch as those who have perverted justice face judgment, while those who had faced condemnation suddenly discover that they have been set free. And ultimately, we watch as there is a trajectory, a transformation from mourning to joy. And the repeated reversals that we encounter in these closing chapters, they've been placed there intentionally. They're there intentionally because they are intended to focus our attention on the activity of the Lord. Though God has never been specifically named in these verses, by means of these dramatic reversals, we're being prompted to recognize that these situations could never have occurred, these changes could never have taken place without the instigation and the oversight of the King of Heaven. He is the one who has been active here. And though he's remained unseen, he has been laboring steadfastly all the while to ensure that his people receive salvation and that the wicked receive justice. Additionally, however, I'm inclined to think that there is a lesson for us here. I think that there's a lesson for us here about the seasonality, about the seasonal character of life. We need to see that there may be times in our lives when God so provisions us that we are in a position to seek after the welfare of others. But there can also be times when we are the ones who are in need, and we must receive from others what we are unable to provide for ourselves. And there is encouragement for both of those occasions here in this passage. We need to see that when the Lord sees fit to open his hand of blessing and to grant us both peace and abundance, then we're also being granted the opportunity and indeed the responsibility to care for those whose circumstances may be less fortunate than our own. Alternatively, there may be times when God sees fit to provide for us through the generosity of others. And on those occasions, we can't be too proud to accept those expressions of care when they are offered. As the preacher says in Ecclesiastes, there is a time to give and there is a time to receive, but both of these times come to us from the hand of the Lord. Now, the really extraordinary thing about these opening verses of chapter 8, however, is that Mordecai's advancement, it doesn't end there. When Xerxes realizes who Mordecai is, when he discovers that this man who has once saved his life is also the cousin to his queen, he responds by giving Mordecai not just Haman's property, but his position as well. And he signifies that by giving Mordecai his signet ring, the very ring that until recently had been worn on the hand of Haman the Agagite. And as we'll soon see, there's another of those reversals here, because the very instrument which had been used to seal the fate of the Jews will shortly be used to effect their rescue. The upshot of all of this, then, is that Haman's life has been lost, while the lives of Mordecai and Esther had not only been secured, they'd also been greatly enriched. Yet despite this extraordinary reversal of fortune, all remains far from well. And in this sense, the story of Esther differs radically from the heroic tales that we're used to. And that's because this time the villain's death doesn't resolve the central crisis of the story. Haman's body may be suspended on that stake, but the specter of his evil lives on in the decree that he had written, a decree which authorized the destruction of God's people at the hands of their enemies. And that's why just a few verses after having been handsomely rewarded by the king, we find Esther once again coming into the king's presence, and this time she casts herself down before him in grief and desperation. And I'd like us to note two things about Esther's interactions with Xerxes here in these verses. First of all, we want to remind ourselves of the work that God has been doing in the hearts and in the lives of his people. In previous sermons, we have spoken about how God takes his people, how God moves his people, how he lifts them up from where they are and he takes them to where they need to be. And there's clear evidence of that transformative process here in this passage. Recall how at the beginning of this story, Esther had been prepared not only to hide her Jewish identity, but to accommodate herself to the life and to the rhythms and to the customs of the Persian harem. At that point, the degree of Esther's allegiance to God and his people was questionable at best. But that isn't where God has left her. He's been working in her heart in a way that has transformed both her sensibilities and her priorities. And the success of his work can be seen in the fact that at this point in the story, she has so completely identified herself with the plight of her people that even after her personal fortunes and safety have been secured, she remains utterly distraught by the plight of the Jews. Her heart has been changed. And it's been changed in such a way that she's now driven by, she's now motivated by a love for her neighbor rather than herself. And once again, we're being prompted to see that this is the kind of change that can only be brought about by the God who knows and who sees the hearts of men. Secondly, despite the enormity of her grief and the depth of her desperation, Esther continues to act with consummate skill as she intercedes with Xerxes for the welfare of her people. And that's something that I want to note specifically because that hasn't been the line that most commentators have taken as they've interpreted Esther's behavior in this passage. The prevailing notion seems to be that while to this point Esther has been a smooth operator who has acted with the precision of a grandmaster playing chess, now with Haman having been dispatched, she breaks down into an emotional and a blubbering mess. Well, I'm not buying it, and I don't think you should either. I think that far from losing control, Esther once again knows precisely what she is doing, and she knows exactly who she is dealing with. And let me tell you why that's so. First of all, we need to appreciate how her behavior here is in keeping with both her circumstances and her need. Realize that earlier in her contest with Haman, Esther's aims had been comparatively limited. At that point, she's only been trying to outmaneuver one man. Now, there's no doubt that it wasn't an easy task. Esther needed to convince the king to somehow do away with his most trusted advisor, and she needed to convince him to be willing to give up the payment that Haman had promised him in accord with the destruction of the Jews. But in the end, this wasn't a course correction that Xerxes couldn't find a way to explain and to recover from. And in that context, Esther's cool, her calculated behavior, it had been appropriate to both her aim and her circumstances. But let's think about the task that's facing Esther now. Now it's not just a matter of outmaneuvering a single man. Now it's a matter of finding a way around the entire edifice of Persian law and Persian custom, the whole might of the bureaucracy of the Persian Empire is set against her. And in this context, subtlety and cunning aren't going to cut it. No, what's needed in this context is passion and brute force, and that is precisely what Esther displays when she falls before the king. And her approach here, it's not just dictated by her circumstances, but also by the fact that if she is going to have any hope of thwarting Haman's decree, then she's going to need Xerxes to get on board with this plan. She's going to need the support of the king. And that's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem because Xerxes couldn't care less about the fate of the Jews. That's clear from the way that Xerxes responds to her appeal. He basically says to her, look, lady, I've done away with Haman. I've had him impaled on the stake that he built. And I've taken all Haman's wealth, and I've given it to you. And I've taken all Haman's power, and I've given it to Mordecai. And I really don't know what more you expect me to do. What more could you want? Xerxes is a man who's only capable about thinking of his own welfare and his own happiness. And as such, it never occurs to him that Esther might be concerned about something other than her own security and advancement. Quite simply, Xerxes doesn't care about the Jews, and he can't figure out why anyone else would either. And Esther, she knows how his mind works, which is why she approaches him the way that she does. She's no slobbering, blubbering, out-of-control mess. There's thoughtfulness here. There's precision, even in the midst of her tears. Notice, for instance, how she phrases her request in conditional terms and in a way that ties together his personal happiness with hers. She basically says to him, if it would please you, and if I have found favor in your eyes, and if you have taken delight in me, notice all the yous, all the personal focus here. There's nothing in Esther's appeal about right or wrong. There's not a word about justice or injustice, and that's because those are categories that Xerxes doesn't understand. No, once again, Esther speaks the only language that he gets, and that is the language of self-interest. Every word she says is completely focused on the question of his personal pleasure and happiness. And she speaks this way in an effort to make his continued delight and contentment contingent upon him alleviating her sadness. If you want to be happy, and if you want to continue to take delight and pleasure in me, she says, then you're going to need to step up and act here. And it's so important for us to remember that as Esther lays this challenge before the king, she does so in a context where he has already repeatedly and publicly declared that he does delight in her. And so in effect, she's demanding that he back up his words with actions. If you love me, she says, then prove it. And do so by working to save my people from destruction. And Xerxes' response to her request, it teaches us a great deal about the state, about the nature, about the character of the unregenerate human heart. Ultimately, even the pursuit of his own pleasure doesn't provide sufficient motivation for him to get personally involved. And so in a manner that closely parallels Pilate's behavior when Jesus stood before him, Xerxes decides that he just can't be bothered to ensure that justice gets done. So while he assents to their request, at least insofar as he doesn't stand in their way, beyond that, he simply washes his hands of any further responsibility, and Xerxes goes on about his life. Look, he says, you know as well as I do that a royal decree can't be revoked. So you've basically asked me to do the impossible. And I'm not really of a mind to try and make that happen. But hey, you've got my authority and you've got my ring. So go ahead, knock yourselves out. Who knows, maybe you'll find some way to work around Haman's decree. And here we see not just how selfish the human heart can be, we're also shown how utterly lost those hearts really are. And that's because these hearts, these sinful Xerxes hearts, they're not being moved from where they are. No, they're being left precisely where they've chosen to be. Think about it for a moment. Xerxes' response shows that he clearly hasn't learned anything from these experiences. Unlike Esther, his heart hasn't been changed at all. Once again, he's simply prepared to hand over his ring and hand over his power without so much as a thought for what might happen. And I mean, you'd think that even a slow coach like Xerxes would at least have had a moment's pause here, especially given how badly, how spectacularly this very policy had backfired last time. But nope. He's far too concerned with his own affairs to trouble himself with thoughts about consequences or thoughts about the welfare of his subjects. By the grace of God, however, this time the royal signet ring, it falls into the hands of those who will use that power rightly. It falls into the hands of those who will use that power to uphold justice rather than to pervert it. And it falls into the hands of those who will seek to provide a means of rescue for God's people. And that rescue, it's achieved by means of a second decree which, though it's issued in the name of the king, has actually been drafted by Mordecai. Now, as Xerxes had noted, Mordecai wasn't going to be able to find a way to simply nullify or to invalidate the decree that Haman had proclaimed. But what Mordecai could do was to issue another edict that countermanded the first. And so what he does in this second decree is to authorize the Jews to gather and to defend themselves against any attacks that they faced on the appointed day. And this morning, there are two things that we want to make note of here. There are two observations we want to make about this decree. First of all, we want to say something about the context in which this decree is made. And secondly, we want to take note of the response that this decree creates. Two things, the context in which this decree is made, and secondly, the response that it generates. First of all, then, we want to say something about the context in which this decree is made. And the context is critically important here, because knowing something about the context in which this edict is issued will help us to better understand the tone and the character and the nature of this edict. And that's important because there are things about this decree that can leave us feeling uncomfortable. We might wonder, for instance, about how just this decree really is. After all, we've been outraged. We've been outraged this entire time by the injustice and the immorality of Haman's efforts to see the Jews put to death. But doesn't Mordecai's decree have essentially the same effect? And if it was reprehensible for the Persians to launch an attack on the Jews, how can it suddenly be justifiable for the Jews to respond in kind? And at this point, we might try to soften any feelings of discomfort that we might have by pointing out that Mordecai's edict, it only authorizes violence as a means of self-defense. The Jews were only permitted to put to death those who had come to do them harm. Now, that's certainly true. But the difficulty is that that's not all of the violence that this second decree allows for. Mordecai's edict, it also gave the Jews the right to prosecute this fight against the families, against the wives and the children of those who attacked them. And it also gave them the right to lay hold of their property. It gave them the right to plunder those whom they'd slain. And how can that kind of behavior possibly be justified? Well, beloved, these are very challenging questions. Mountains of ink have been written or spilled on these issues. But we need to see this morning that the key to confronting these questions honestly, it requires an awareness of the context in which this decree is issued. And the context in which this decree is issued is one of a holy war. And in order to appreciate what's meant by that term, we need to see that the conflict which occurs in these pages, it isn't just a regular run-of-the-mill conflict that's arisen between two rival peoples or ethnic groups. This isn't a conflict that's focused on some kind of political or territorial dispute. The issue here isn't one of plunder or power, of wealth or of glory. No, this is an altogether different kind of conflict, because the battle that's waging here is one of cosmic proportions. And that's something we've already touched on several sermons ago when we considered the question of what it is that lies beneath these events as they unfold in time and space. And at that time we came to see that the struggle between Mordecai and Haman, it was part of a much larger, of a much older conflict. It was part of a conflict that had been unfolding since the moment that Adam and Eve fell into sin and disobedience in the Garden of Eden. And that's something that we were alerted to when we were first introduced to Haman. We're told that Haman was an Agagite. And we came to see that regardless of whether or not he was a biological descendant of King Agag and the Amalekites, Haman was most assuredly their spiritual descendant. The evidence for that can be seen in his determination to ensure that not just Mordecai, but every single one of the Jews was destroyed. And knowing that, it helps us to understand why this story does not end the way that we would expect it to. It helps us to understand why this story doesn't end with the villain's death, and why the specter of Haman's evil lives on after his demise. Because when we're aware of what's really happening here, then we'll understand that the true architect of Haman's decree, it wasn't Haman, it was Haman's father. It was the evil one himself. It is Satan who wants to destroy. It is Satan who wants to kill and to annihilate the Jews, because if he could succeed in bringing about their complete destruction, it would mean bringing an end to any hope of the promised Messiah. Haman, then, as well as the enemies of the Jews who attack them on the 13th day of the month of Adar, they represent the forces of sin and darkness. And the war that they are prosecuting is a war that isn't focused on earthly conquest and material advantage. It's a war that seeks to bring about the complete overthrow of God's will. It's a war that is intended to bring about the complete destruction of God's kingdom. But they're being opposed. The forces of sin and darkness are being opposed, and they are being opposed by the Almighty God Himself. And we need to see and we need to appreciate that God has been working here in the pages of Esther to ensure not only that His kingdom is eternally established, but to see that all of those who oppose Him and His will are destroyed to the uttermost. The prosecution of that war, It's something that is made necessary. It's something that's necessitated by his own divine character. Because God is perfectly holy, because he is perfectly righteous, he cannot tolerate any kind of sin or rebellion to go unopposed or unpunished. Because he is who he is, his holiness, it must proceed in wrath and judgment against anything and anyone who is not holy as he is holy. So what does all of this have to do with the context in which this decree gets issued? Well, what we need to see is that at this point in time, at this point in the course of redemptive history, God was prosecuting his holy war through the agency of his chosen people. And God, he had commanded the people of Israel to destroy, indeed to utterly destroy, all those who were acting as agents of sin and darkness in this world. Now let's be clear, that didn't mean that every conflict that the Israelites found themselves involved with could be identified as or construed as being part of this holy war. That's why we took some time to read from Deuteronomy 20 this morning. There the Lord makes a distinction between the kinds of conflicts that Israel would become engaged in. And in particular, he makes a distinction between the conflicts that the people of God would have with the nations who lived in the land of Canaan and those who lived at a great distance from them. When Israel became involved in a war with those who lived beyond the borders of the Promised Land, then God explicitly forbade them from killing anyone but the male combatants. The women and the children of those nations were not to be harmed, though they could be claimed as plunder. But that wasn't the case for the nations who lived within the confines of the Promised Land. No, when Israel went to war against those people, all of them and everything they owned were to be utterly destroyed. Men, women, children were to die, but not a hand was to be laid on the plunder. And why? Why is that so? Because this was not a normal war. This wasn't an ordinary conflict. This was a holy war, a war that was not being prosecuted for territory or gain, but a war that was being waged by a holy God against sin and death and darkness. And that's so important for us to understand, because we need to be absolutely clear that what made this a holy war isn't the fact that it involved the Jews and any other random people. This wasn't an ethnic or a racial conflict, even though the Israelites were God's chosen people. And that's made clear by the fact that when they proved faithless and when they proved unrighteous, God's wrath would proceed against the people of Israel. Think of Achan and the sin of Achan. Achan, who stole plunder from the city of Jericho. What were the consequences of Achan's actions? God's wrath proceeded against his people. And he prosecutes his holy war against their sin and iniquity. And it is only when justice is done and the camp has been purified of Achan's sin that God's righteous wrath against his people relents. Now, we also read this morning of how, as part of the prosecution of God's holy war, God had decreed that the Amalekites be set aside for special destruction. Why was that so? Because they had been the first of all the nations of the earth to try to destroy God's people. And they had sought to accomplish that goal in the most heinous and egregious of ways, as the Israelites had come up out of Egypt and into the wilderness, as they were tired and exhausted and fatigued, as their lines were stretched out, and the weak, the elderly, and the sick, and the women and the children were stretched out in the background. It is there that Amalek attacks in an attempt to try to wipe out God's people before they could regain their strength. And so, on account of this outrage, God's indignation burned against them, and he decreed that he would wipe the very memory of them from the earth. And that, brothers and sisters, that is the struggle that is unfolding here in the pages of Esther. God is prosecuting his holy war against the Amalekites, and he does so through the actions and through the decrees of Mordecai. It's by means of Mordecai's hand that God seeks to put an end to Amalek and to bring justice to the wicked. And in that context, Mordecai is acting both justly and faithfully. For he was fulfilling the decree of God against Amalek when he authorized the destruction of not just the aggressors, but the families of those aggressors as well. Now, we will have more to say about this concept of holy war and its prosecution next week when we look at the actual execution of Mordecai's edict, and we speak about that when we consider chapter 9. But for now, we need to be aware that at this time and in this context, Mordecai's edict, it must be understood as an expression of God's judgment against sin. What we also need to appreciate, however, is that even in this time and place, Mordecai's edict was met with rejoicing. And not just rejoicing by the Jews who were understandably excited and relieved by the reversal of their fortunes. But this decree, this just decree, was also enjoyed by the peoples of the Persian Empire. The last question that we want to deal with this morning is why? Why would that be so? Why, in the first place, would the peoples rejoice? Well, I would suggest to you, brothers and sisters, that the peoples of the Persian Empire rejoiced because there is an innate desire in human beings to see that justice is done. And that's because there's comfort in justice. There's comfort in knowing that justice has been carried out. There's comfort in knowing that justice has been carried out because it keeps us feeling safe. Things have been set right. Things have been done the way that they ought to have been done. And you can imagine that if you are one of the other peoples in the Persian Empire who is reading this sudden and arbitrary decree that's being written against the Jews, it doesn't take a rocket science to wonder if your people might be next. If the Jews could be devoted to slaughter at a whim and the word of a king, what was to say that any other people couldn't be devoted to slaughter? So the justice of Mordecai's decree in authorizing the Jews to band together and to defend themselves, it brings relief and it brings with it a sense of joy for the peoples of this empire. And here I would just quote this verse from Proverbs 11. Proverbs 11, verse 10. When it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices, and when the wicked perish, there are shouts of gladness. Proverbs speaks to us about the wisdom and the necessity of justice, even in a sin-darkened world. But it's not just the peoples of the land who rejoice, it's the Jews as well. And again, we might ask ourselves why. Because after all, at the end of the day, what is it that has really changed? The Jews are still in grave danger. Haman's edict remains in force. The peoples of the nations can band together and attack the Jews and plunder them for their property, which means that safety is going to be elusive and hard days are going to lie ahead. And yet the people of God respond to the news of Mordecai's decree with joy and celebration and feasting. Why is that the case? Well, it has everything to do with the way that this chapter ends. At the conclusion of this chapter, we watch as Mordecai departs from the king's presence. And how does he depart? He departs as a picture of royal splendor. Take a moment this afternoon to go back and read the description in chapter 1 of Xerxes' court and the way in which the splendor of his court is described, and then compare that to the way in which Mordecai's clothing is described when he departs from the king's presence. There is an exact analog between these two things. Mordecai leaves from the presence of the king having been exalted and lifted up. He is clothed in royal robes. He has a gold crown upon his head. And it is the exaltation of their leader that causes the rejoicing of God's people. And why is that? Because they see in his exaltation what Zeresh had seen in Haman's downfall, the certainty of it. When Zeresh had heard of the reversal of fortune that Haman had experienced, her immediate response to him is to say, your downfall is certain. It may only have just begun, but your wickedness will be brought low. Well, when the people of God hear of the splendor in which Mordecai departs from the king's presence, they see their leader lifted up, and they know in that moment that their victory is assured. They may not know how, they may not know what form it will take, but in his exaltation, they find their hope and they find the reason to rejoice. And so on the day that that edict is decreed, the people of God feasted and they celebrated. They had reason for joy. They had reason to enjoy justice that day. Well, brothers and sisters, this morning we have an even greater reason for joy. For today, on this Sunday, as on every Sunday, what is it that we recall? The victory and the exaltation of our leader. We remember how our leader, our King, the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, has been lifted up, how he has been exalted on high. And we see him in the heavens, seated at his Father's right hand, clothed in glory. And he bears the marks of royal splendor upon himself. But the marks of his splendor and exaltation are the nail holes in his hands, the nail holes in his feet, the side that was pierced by a Roman spear. Those are the signs of his glory. Those are the signs of his victory. Those are the signs of his exaltation. And those, beloved, those are the reasons for our hope, for our certainty, and for our celebration on this Sabbath day. For we are reminded that once again justice will be enjoyed. It will be enjoyed fully and completely in the day of our Lord's return, when he comes to establish an eternal kingdom on earth as well as in heaven. Amen.